The third lecture in the introduction to the course Interpreting the New Testament will have to do with the location of meaning.
We can move perhaps more quickly through some of these points because they've already been elucidated earlier, but this might just emphasize what's been said or drive it home if you haven't caught it yet. And so part of the language of our day is to talk about interpretation behind the text, in the text, and in front of the text. This is another way of representing kind of the triangle of interpretation. There's the historical perspective, where the author's and original audience's context is to be established and how the text was produced. But then in the text readings are more literary. It's reading the texts as literature. The text's context in relationship to other literature, that's called intertextuality, or within the writing itself. So intertextuality is, for example, how does the New Testament author use the Old Testament? And in terms of co-text, how does this passage fit within the writing as a whole? And then in front of the text reading has to do with the reader's perspective. How do the reader's contexts lead to certain understandings of the text? What are the precautions here? And then also, how do we use the text? All of this we've talked about so far in this lecture. Notice that by text we mean either the original text as written by the author or the translated text as read by the reader. As we look at the triangle of interpretation in terms of author, text, and readers, we can see that over the history of New Testament interpretation, and Old Testament interpretation too, certain methodologies of interpretation have developed around the author and his context, the text and its context, and the readers and their context. And so this slide suggests that there are these different methods of getting at the meaning understood in the different ways we've been talking about it. But also just a note on the slide that some say, and these methods need to be deconstructed. And so this slide tries to present the different views right here. So the types of methods that have been developed over the years have been methods like the historical contextual study of Scripture, the historical critical method, we might say. Textual criticism, source criticism, form criticism, tradition criticism, redaction criticism, social science criticism. These tend to be behind the text types of interpretation. And they have been developed for the last couple hundred years. Then more recently, there's been a focus on criticisms that come primarily out of recent literary study, except in this list, the rhetorical criticism is a very ancient, pre-first century approach to studying communication. And it can be applied not only to spoken communication, to speeches, but also to written communication. And that has more recently been applied in the history of scholarship, say from about the 1980s. So these more literary approaches are often more recent developments, like composition, literary, narrative criticism. Canon criticism is more of a biblical theological approach, which says read this text not only in terms of the author, but in terms of the whole of the canon of Scripture. Structuralism was popular about 4 decades ago, and it is something that was quickly replaced by more reader-oriented approaches. But structuralism said there's a basic structure to the way in which communication is made, and how stories are told, for example. And so structuralism had a short life, but can still be relevant for interpretation today, especially with narratives. How do you tell a story? And then rhetorical criticism goes right back to the time of Aristotle and before, and so there has been a lot of discussion about what's involved in narrative interpretation. Then there's discourse analysis and critical functional linguistics. These are more recent approaches to interpretation that focuses more on the written word than some background information. And then there's a focus on the readers and how readers go about bringing meaning into the text. Reader response criticism, ideological readings, contextual theologies, and even theological exegesis would be examples of this. As we look at the locus of meaning and discuss this from different perspectives, we should give some attention, some significant attention, to the relationship between meaning and genre. And I want to say a few things just in brief about this to open up the subject rather than try to be exhaustive on it. One thing to note is something that Umberto Eco has discussed in his work, The Open Work, and the role of the reader. The discussion Eco gives about reading texts is a discussion that distinguishes open and closed texts. Now, he doesn't apply this to Scripture, but I think this is quite important. A closed text is where the meaning is what the author says. An open text is the meaning resonates with the audience's situation and practices. Now, in communicating through a letter, that's a particular genre, an author like Paul is trying to address an audience that is specific and communicate something very specific and clear to that audience. The author is not inviting the audience to construct meaning, but rather to hear what he's saying. Now, an open text, over against that, an open text is where the author actually is writing in a genre that engages the audience in the discovery of meaning. Now, we might say that here's where we need to use Hirsch's distinction of different types of meaning. We could say there are some genre that don't place the emphasis on the meaning of the author, that is the author's intention, but rather place the emphasis on the words from which different readers can find different significance of meanings or even new implications of the meaning of the text. So my example would be the Psalms and poetry in general. Poetry is written not so that the readers will understand the original context in which the author wrote the poem, but rather find in the words meanings that resonate with their situation and practices. Love poetry, for example, doesn't require you to understand who the author actually is in love with, or even what century it was, but it's great if it speaks across the centuries to the human heart and anyone in love. Now, in between something like the letter and poetry would be something, a genre like prophecy. Prophecy is often written in poetical form, which already tells us something about its openness. But prophecy can have more than one fulfillment. If the day of the Lord, for example, refers to a specific event in Israel's history, the event of salvation and judgment in the day of the Lord's coming can also apply to other times that God will come with salvation and judgment, and indeed to the ultimate time when God will come in salvation and judgment. say, for example, in the second coming of Jesus Christ. And so later readers could read those prophetic words about the day of the Lord and find in them implications for a theology that goes beyond a specific time in history and a specific place where that passage might have been fulfilled. The language of in the prophecy of the day of the Lord that talks about God coming in judgment is poetic language, and the use of poetry allows one to interpret that passage for other contexts than just the initially intended context. So a text on the day of the Lord talking about God's judgment of Israel or God's judgment of the Babylonians could be applied beyond those specific judgment days to the ultimate day of the Lord. This open and closed text approach helps us appreciate some greater diversity within Scripture, that the location of meaning is related to the type of genre that is used. Now, Paul Ricoeur, in his work in hermeneutics, is quite a significant person, and he's written so much that one cannot simply endorse what he says, but also one can find many things that are helpful. He says, a hermeneutic of revelation must give priority to those modalities of discourse, genre, that are most originary within the language of a community of faith, that are caught up in forms of discourse as diverse as narration, prophecy, legislative texts, wisdom sayings, hymns, supplications, and thanksgivings. So again, he's pointing out the importance of revelation taking place through different genre, and therefore hermeneutics, our interpretation, has to pay attention to that. Two other scholars known for their work in hermeneutics are Anthony Thistleton and Kevin Van Hooser, and both have used what's called speech-act theory to raise our awareness of the dimensions of meaning. Speech-act theory talks about locution, illocution, and perlocution. And the idea here is that speech carries with it some intentionality. We don't just have the words, but the question is, how are the words being used? And when we answer that question, then we are getting closer to the meaning of the text. So locution itself is just what is said. What are the words on the page? What did the person say in the communication? But illocution takes us beyond just the words. It asks the question, what's happening through this speech? Is someone stating something? Is someone commanding something? Pleading something? Is someone taking an oath? Is someone asking a question? And so forth. So in a marriage ceremony, when someone says, I do, that's purely the locution, the words I do. But the illocution is that someone's actually getting married. Something is happening beyond simply stating something, but the intentionality, the illocution here, is that saying these words means that one is committing to, or really taking an oath, committing to a marriage that is binding. And then perlocution is what is the desired outcome of the speech. One is trying to convince someone, one is trying to embarrass someone, one is trying to reprove someone, and so forth. So speech is not just the words used, but also the intentionality of the words, how you do things with words. And so it's speech that is a speech act that involves locution, illocution, and perlocution. And so genre helps us get at the different speech acts, helps us understand the author's speech action. A proverb needs to be treated differently from a narrative, from poetry, from prophecy, or a letter. Building on this kind of way of thinking, John Goldingay has written on this in terms of models of Scripture, and in it, in this particular book by this name, he looks at 4 models: the narrative, the instruction or law, the prophecy, and the wisdom. And as an Old Testament scholar, he has primarily Old Testament texts in view here. Wisdom literature, the narratives of Scripture, the law in the Old Testament, and prophecy. Goldingay says a lot about these things, and it's worth reading, but also reading critically. And with this chart, it's not a chart that he has in his book, but it's a chart that tries to capture some of his thought on the 4 different genres. I have presented here some of the categories and some of the ideas that he has. And all I want to do in this lecture is point to the bold orange part of this. So look at the first column and the first row. And so we could talk about the narrative genre with respect to the direction of speech, the forms of communicative statements, the purposes of speech, the models of utterance within Scripture, traditions, varying forms of response, the location of meaning, the interpreter's focuses, and the relation between testaments. And we can look not only at narrative, but also the instructional or law types of Scripture, the prophecy, the prophetic, and then the experiential and revelatory types of Scripture. Now, the main point is the point that I want to make here. And the main point is how genre relates to the intention of the author, and the intention of the author relates to the speech in terms of speech acts in the literature, not just words on their own, but you can get at, through the genre, you can get at the illocutionary and perlocutionary acts that the author is rendering when writing the way he does.